For the 5th Panzer Army's main effort, General von Manteuffel planned for 2 Panzer Corps to attack abreast. The 58th Panzer Corps, commanded by Generaloberst Walter Kruger, was to attack on either side of the border village of Uren on the Aar River 10 miles south of St. Vith. It would then cross the northern reaches of the ridge line the Americans knew as the Skyline Drive and jump the Meuse River just downstream from the bend at Namur. The 47th Panzer Corps, commanded by General der Panzertruppen Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz, was to cross the Aar a few miles farther south, jump the Skyline Drive, take the road centre of Bastogne 19 airline miles beyond the German frontier, and seize crossings of the Meuse upstream from Namur. Each of the Panzer Corps had only 2 divisions, 1 Panzer, 1 Volksgrenadier, but General von Manteuffel had 2 Panzer units in reserve, the Führer-Begleit Brigade, which had the strength of a little better than half a Panzer division, and the Panzer Lehr Division. Von Manteuffel could commit the Führer-Begleit Brigade only with the approval of his superior Field Marshal model, but as soon as General von Luttwitz's 47th Panzer Corps put in a bridge behind its Volksgrenadier Division, he intended to use the Panzer Lehr with that corps. Originally a part of the Pennsylvania National Guard, the 28th Infantry Division, which had been fighting since Normandy and had incurred such losses in the Hurtgen Forest that people had begun calling its red bucket-shaped keystone shoulder patch the Bloody Bucket, held such an elongated defensive front that each of the Panzer Corps was destined to strike little more than a regiment. In the north, Kruger's 58th Panzer Corps faced only some 3,000 or so men of the division's 112th Infantry, while von Luttwitz's 47th Panzer Corps faced the 110th Infantry. The division's 3rd Regiment, the 109th Infantry, was to become involved with the supporting attack by the 7th Army. Thus, the ratio of attacker to defender was roughly 10-1. The Germans that Private First Class Allard and other members of the patrol from Company F, 112th Infantry, came upon on the night of December 15th, while making their way back across the Aar River near Uren, were from the 560th Volksgrenadier Division. Created from occupation troops in Denmark and Norway, the division had seen no combat and had had only limited training, and one of its 3 regiments had yet to arrive from Denmark. Its running mate, on the other hand, the 116th Panzer Division, known as the Windhund Division, had a long distinguished record on the battlefield, having fought in Normandy and having previously dealt the 112th Infantry a crippling blow in the Hurtgen Forest. The division was nearly at full strength in men and had close to 100 tanks, mostly Panthers and assault guns. The positions held by the 112th Infantry constituted an extension of the line of the 106th Division and had the same basic weakness, a river at the back. Yet nothing ever happened in the Ardennes, so why relinquish ground within the pillbox belt of the West Wall dearly bought with American blood? Only 2 of the regiment's battalions were in the line, one in and around the village of Lutzkampen, close to the flank of the 106th Division's 424th Infantry, the other a little to the southwest near the village of Sevenig. The 3rd Battalion occupied backup defensive positions on the west bank of the Our but was, in essence, a reserve. Although the regiment had lost almost 2,000 men in the Hurtgen Forest, the commander, Carl Gustin M. Nelson, considered the replacements to be well-trained and highly motivated. The 112th Infantry was defending the sector where General von Manteuffel had decreed that there should be no artillery preparation, so that 80-man shock companies might infiltrate up wooded draws between the widely spaced American positions, attack from flanks and rear, and strike swiftly for bridges over the Our. When the searchlights flicked on in the early morning darkness of December 16th, and German artillery opened fire to north and south, but not on the positions of the 112th Infantry, the men in the foxholes were left to wonder, however reverentially, why not them too. In the darkness, a small German force attacked mortar positions behind the 3D Battalion near Sevenig, but the mortarmen had well-prepared foxholes near their pieces and fought off the assault. Another force caught a platoon of Company L at breakfast, captured the kitchen, killed the platoon leader, and put the men to flight. The first indication that Germans were moving in behind the 1st Battalion near Lutzkampen came with word of the ambush of a kitchen truck returning from the front, but there was little other evidence of the enemy presence until approaching daylight revealed German troops marching in the open. When one of the shock companies came under devastating flanking fire from the 424th Infantry to the north, that part of the attack collapsed. As 25 Germans emerged from a wood to move past an exposed crossroads, small arms fire killed 4 and the rest surrendered. The battalion commander himself, Lieutenant Colonel William H. Allen, manned a .50 caliber machine gun protecting an anti-tank gun near his headquarters. When he had exhausted his ammunition, a score of Germans lay dead and 40 surrendered. Meanwhile, a group of 40 Germans had moved through the darkness toward the southernmost of the 2 bridges at Urin. At close to 9:30 a.m., men of the 3D Battalion's headquarters and cannon companies, having rushed to foxholes previously prepared for a close-in defense of Urin, spotted them. "Get them when they cross the bridge," yelled the personnel officer, Captain William B. Cowan. The men thought at first that the Germans were prisoners on their way to the rear, but when it became obvious that they were armed, everybody heeded Cowan's order to fire. Some of the Germans fell on the bridge, others made it across a little farther, and only a few managed to get away. Somebody on the German side nevertheless reported overeagerly that the 560th Volksgrenadier Division had seized a bridge across the Aue. With the coming of daylight, German artillery and Nebelwerfers at last opened fire, but since the German troops were in and behind the American line, the artillerymen had to direct most of their fire well to the rear against American artillery positions and villages beyond our American mortars, and artillery at the same time caught Germans in the open or in the draws and exacted a heavy toll. Shortly before noon, the commander of the 112th Infantry, Colonel Nelson, ordered his 2D Battalion to move from the west bank of the Aue through Uren and counterattack to clear the enemy from between the village and the 3D Battalion's positions. By nightfall, that sweep was complete, and the positions abandoned by the platoon of Company L restored. Also shortly before noon, the commander of the 116th Panzer Division, General Major Siegfried von Woldenberg, decided to commit tanks to try to get his Panzer Grenadiers moving. The first attempt ended in failure when fire from the adjacent 424th Infantry knocked out 2 tanks and 3 others fell back. Soon after that, the commander of the 58th Panzer Corps, General Kruger, informed that the Volksgrenadiers had taken one of the 2 bridges at Uren, ordered von Woldenberg to end his try for the 2 bridges farther north and join in the fight to take Uren itself. That was what halted the threat to the 424th Infantry's flank. The dragon's teeth of the west wall in front of the 3D Battalion's positions sharply restricted the routes available to the German tanks and made them ready prey for American guns. A second German attempt to get tanks forward failed when PFC Paul C. Rosenthal, the gunner in the crew of a towed 3-inch tank destroyer supporting the 424th Infantry, expending only 18 rounds, knocked out 5. A third try failed when the lead tank of a group of 5 set off a mine and the others turned back under fire from 57 mm anti-tank guns. A fourth and fifth attempt failed when towed guns of a company of the 630th Tank Destroyer Battalion attached to the 112th Infantry, but firing from dug-in positions on a ridge behind the Aue knocked out 6. A final foray by 3 German tanks equipped with flamethrowers ended with another assist by towed tank destroyers supporting the 424th Infantry. Since the report of a captured bridge at Uren proved to be false, the only real success to which the 58th Panzer Corps might point at the end of the first day was a small bridgehead established by the Volksgrenadiers over the Our in an undefended sector downstream from Uren. There the bridge had long been destroyed. Its debris blocked the site, and felled trees and mines denied egress along the exit road on the far bank, so that there was little hope that German engineers could bridge the river swiftly. That meant that the 2 bridges at Uren, although denied by American defences against which the Germans had made few inroads, still constituted the most likely way for the 58th Panzer Corps to get past its first obstacle in the drive for the Meuse. It had clearly been a less than rewarding day for Kruger's 58th Panzer Corps. Although the losses of the 116th Panzer Division were moderate, they included 13 tanks and at least 80 men captured, and one of the leading shock companies had been wiped out by flanking fire from men of the 424th Infantry. The inexperienced Volksgrenadiers had lost close to 1,000 men. Of greater importance, the 112th Infantry had delayed one of von Manteuffel's 2 main columns for 24 hours. On the other hand, as night fell on December 16th, the men of the 112th Infantry knew that their foe was still there and hardly likely to desist after only one day of attack. "Nobody able to sleep and no hot meals today," one man wrote in his diary. "This place is not healthy anymore." Hurley Edward Fuller was known as a curmudgeon. A Texan, he had enlisted in the United States Army in 1916. The next year attended officer candidate school and obtained a commission as a second lieutenant of infantry and went to France, where he fought in the bitter campaign in the Argonne forest. Fuller was for long disenchanted by that experience, but he stayed in the army, where he established a reputation as a capable but irascible commander, a man with a cantankerous disposition. After commanding the 2D Division's 23D Infantry for a year and a half, he brought the regiment ashore in Normandy on D-Day +1, but lasted in combat only 10 days before the soft-spoken but firm Walter Robertson relieved him of his command. Something about having manoeuvred his regiment into an untenable position. Still determined to fight, Fuller had gone to an old friend, Troy Middleton of the 8th Corps, also a veteran of the American Expeditionary Force, and asked for help. Although Middleton recommended to General Bradley, then commanding the 1st Army, that Fuller be given another chance, Bradley was moved up to command the 12th Army Group, and nothing came of Middleton's recommendation until November, when a vacancy developed in the command of the 110th Infantry. As the 28th Division had just been transferred to the 8th Corps, Middleton suggested to the division commander that Fuller fill the slot. Assuming command of the 110th Infantry in late November, only a few days before turning 50, Colonel Fuller moved the regimental command post from a farm village to the more comfortable locale of Clairvaux, a charming old town set astride a bend in the Clairve River, in a deep, narrow basin formed by the merging of 4 precipitous wooded gorges. The narrow streets, framed by houses and shops with sharply pitched roofs, were dominated by a chateau. Dating from the 12th century and situated on a promontory near the eastern edge of town, the chateau, although small, had most of the usual attributes of a castle except a moat, 2 turreted towers, a massive stone entranceway with heavy wooden doors built to withstand siege, a cobblestoned interior courtyard, and dungeon-like cellars. Long a magnet for tourists, Clairvaux had the hotels to go with it, thus making the town an ideal rest centre for troops of the 110th Infantry and for other units of the 28th Division. Colonel Fuller established his headquarters in the Hotel Claravallis in the western part of town near the railroad station. Hurley Fuller made few changes in the dispositions of his troops from those of his predecessor, for what choice had he? The deep gorge of the Our River in front of his regiment was so forbidding that his division commander, Major General Norman D. Cotter, had elected to achieve such concentration as was possible on a 25-mile front at either end of the line, in the north, where the 112th Infantry held a bridgehead beyond the Our River, and in the south where the 109th Infantry constituted, in effect, a part of the defences of Luxembourg City. That left the 110th Infantry responsible for 15 miles of front in the centre, and to add to the regiment's difficulty, Fuller had to furnish the division's sole infantry reserve, a battalion positioned a few miles behind the Clairve River, near a principal highway leading to Bastogne. Since manning a 15-mile line close alongside the Our with 2 battalions was an obvious impossibility, the regiment stationed squad-sized outposts near the river during the daytime and patrolled a mile or so of open slopes and steep-walled draws between the river and the Skyline Drive at night. So, too, with the available troops, a solid defensive line along the Skyline Drive was impossible. Instead, the regiment blocked each of 5 roads leading up from the valley of the Our and onto the west with a rifle company, garrisoning either a village astride the Ridge Road or a village just in front of or behind it. The 2 points of greatest concern were at Marnach, through which ran a principal road leading through Clairvaux and onto Bastogne, and at Hosingen, roughly in the centre of the regimental sector, through which another road led fairly directly to Bastogne. Each of the 2 battalions ostensibly held out a reserve company, but both of those were also responsible for defending a village just behind the Skyline Drive, through which other roads to the west also passed. In other villages, there were only makeshift forces, consisting of the regimental anti-tank company deployed as infantry, and such as was left of the 2 weapons companies, once their heavy machine guns and 81 mm mortars had been parcelled out to the rifle companies. The wide frontage also forced the supporting 109th Field Artillery Battalion into the unusual tactic of widely separating its three firing batteries to enable at least one battery to reach a portion of the front. Even so, to ensure coverage for the entire front, an attached battery from a core artillery unit had to help out. Because of the distance between the infantry positions on the Skyline Drive and the enemy beyond the hour, the firing positions had to be established close behind the crest of the Skyline Drive in unusual proximity to the infantry. Like the other regiments of the 28th Division, the 110th Infantry had received approximately 2,000 replacements for the men lost in the Hurtgen Forest, mostly riflemen and machine gunners, the soldiers with whom combat always deals most harshly. On the assumption that the Ardennes front would remain quiet, Colonel Fuller intended rotating the reserve battalion from time to time with the forward battalions. On the German side, during the 3 nights preceding the assault, one of the German army's more experienced units, the 2D Panzer Division, which had taken heavy losses in Normandy but had retained a solid cadre of experienced non-commissioned officers and officers, made its move forward by the prescribed stages. Rebuilding of the division had started fairly early in the fall so that the replacements were of better caliber than those reaching other divisions at the last minute. The division had 86 tanks, 2/3 of them the latest model Panthers, and 20 assault guns. But the chronic shortage of motor transport afflicted the division much as it did other units. The commander was a newcomer, Colonel Meinrad von Lauchert, a seasoned campaigner of the Eastern Front, whom General von Manteuffel had requested to replace a commander who lacked experience with armor. Veteran of many a fight on the Eastern Front, the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, one of the infantry divisions that had earned its honorific in battle, had moved into the Eifel in October and had held a front almost as wide as that of the 28th Division. Defending in such a quiet sector had enabled the division commander, Karl-Heinz Kokott, a dignified, soft-spoken man of scholarly mien, to re-equip and build up his division with little interference. By December, Kokott had some 17,000 men, considerably more than the recently formed Volksgrenadier divisions, but like everybody else, short on motor transport. The experienced Panzer Lehr division was one of only a few divisions that, even though earmarked for the Ardennes offensive, had been committed to help hold the line in advance of the offensive. In a counter-attack role against the Third Army, the division had incurred heavy losses in both men and tanks. On the night of December 15th, the division had only 57 Mark IV and Panther tanks, although it had received some relief in the attachment of an assault gun brigade and 2 battalions of self-propelled tank destroyers. The division commander, General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, a short, stocky man of 49 who reminded some people of an aggressive terrier, created a task force and advance guard composed of reconnaissance troops, 2 companies of Panzer Grenadiers, and a company of Panthers, which he intended to commit early to exploit the gains of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division. As dictated by General von Manteuffel, the troops were to make direct attacks on American positions at only 2 places, Marnach and Hosingen, in order to open the 2 principal roads leading west. Units not designated for those attacks were to practice what had become known in World War I as Houtier tactics, whereby the troops advanced in small units avoiding prepared enemy positions, leaving them to be mopped up by other units coming later. Since the 26th Volksgrenadier Division had become accustomed to putting outposts across the Ahr after dark, and had learned that American troops withdrew their outposts at nightfall, supporting engineers started building a bridge at the village of Gemund, even before the artillery preparation began. Further north at Dasburg, in the sector of the 2D Panzer Division that could not be done, for access to the site of the demolished bridge, the only site in the vicinity where a bridge might be built was blocked by an electrically operated iron gate anchored in stalwart concrete stanchions, a part of the West Wall defences, and the commander of the 600th Army Engineer Battalion, which was to construct the bridge, Major Georg Luce, was unable to locate the key needed to operate the electrical mechanism. The only alternative was to demolish the gate with explosives, and lest the noise should give away what was happening, that could be done only after the artillery preparation began. Meanwhile, 2 German soldiers carrying a radio had slipped past the American positions and made their way down a steep forested slope into the northern fringe of Clairvaux. They sneaked past the chateau and holed up in a room in the rear of the pharmacy Molitor, across from the Hotel Central in the heart of town. From the pharmacy, they would have a good vantage point once daylight came for directing artillery fire on targets within Clairvaux. The pinpoints of light that the American observer atop the water tower in Hosingen reported at 5:30 a.m. on December 16th were the belchings of 554 organic or attached artillery pieces and Nebelwerfers of the 67th Panzer Corps. As German patrols had long ago established the location of the American positions, the fire was markedly accurate on the forward villages, while Nebelwerfer rockets cascaded into the narrow streets of Clairvaux, awakening the men quartered there on leave and sending civilians scurrying for their cellars or for those of the old chateau. The shelling also awakened the regimental commander, Colonel Fuller, and his executive officer, Lieutenant Colonel Daniel B. Strickler, on the second floor of the Hotel Claravallis. Strickler hurried into Fuller's room, number 10. "What do you make of it?" asked Fuller. "All this big stuff," Strickler responded, "is a sure sign we were in for a fight." Dressing hurriedly, both officers rushed down to the operations room off the lobby of the hotel. Every telephone line to the front line units they discovered was out. So was the line to division headquarters 7 miles to the southwest in the town of Wiltz. Late on December 15th, the commander of the 3D Battalion, 110th Infantry, Major Harold Milton, had directed a training mission to be conducted early the next morning for a section of 81 MMO mortarmen. Protected by a squad of riflemen from Company L, the mortarmen were to move forward from the Skyline Drive and fire on a village just beyond the Aar River. The squad of riflemen had already moved out when the German artillery preparation began. As it lifted, Major Milton cancelled the mission, and Company L commander, First Lieutenant Bert Seaman, sent 2 men in a jeep to tell the riflemen to return. Reaching a crossroads atop the Skyline Drive marked by a lone building, the Café Schinker, the 2 men in the jeep told riflemen of one of Company L platoons defending the crossroads where they were going, and that they and the squad of riflemen would soon be returning. In darkness and thick fog, the jeep continued to the east. A minute or so later, the men at the crossroads heard a squeal of brakes and a burst of small arms fire. When they later saw shadowy forms moving past the crossroads, they were unable to make out whether they were Germans or their fellow riflemen on the way back. Lest they shoot their own men, they held their fire. At the Café Schinker crossroads and almost everywhere else, a heavy ground fog early on December 16th helped the troops of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division get past the defensive positions atop the Skyline Drive. Men of Company K in Hosingen could hear troops crossing the highway to the north, but they could see nothing. South of Hosingen, the Germans were almost on top of one of Company K platoons before the Americans spotted them. Nobody from that platoon got away. Other Germans surprised Battery C, 109th Field Artillery Battalion, in firing positions behind Hosingen. Although the artillerymen lowered the muzzles of their howitzers and opened fire with fuses set for 1 or 2 seconds, the Germans continued to attack, so that for a long time that battery would be fighting for its life and unable to provide any fire support for the infantry. Also, having crossed the Skyline Drive unimpeded, company-sized enemy forces got almost atop the villages of Holzthum and Konstum on the reverse slope of the ridge below the Café Schinker crossroads, and were trying to slip past undetected when men of the 3D Battalion's reserve in Holzthum, Company L, and of the battalion headquarters in Konstum took them under fire. As heavy fighting erupted for both villages, it alerted men of a battery of the attached 687th Field Artillery Battalion just outside Konstum, and enabled the artillerymen to set up a close-in defence bolstered by 2 half-tracks of an anti-aircraft battalion, each with quadruple-mounted .50 caliber machine guns. In at least one case, the fog worked against the Germans. Making out a large body of men approaching, the crew of another US half-track with quad 50 machine guns was unable to determine at first whether they were Germans or Americans. When the approaching troops halted at the sight of the half-track, the crewmen assumed the worst. As they waved the men forward in friendly fashion, the Germans decided that their own side had captured the half-track and advanced. They were within 100 yards when the gunner pressed the button that fired the 4 machine guns in tandem. Close to 100 Germans fell. At the only positions of the 110th Infantry on the forward slope of the Skyline Drive which the first German units were supposed to bypass, the Germans in fact stumbled onto the positions. There, a detached platoon of Company 1, protecting a battalion observation post behind the village of Walhausen, and the rest of Company 1 at the village of Weiler, spotted the Germans in time to bring mortar and artillery fire to bear. Those Germans were destined to be pinned down for the rest of the day. In the meantime, atop the Skyline Drive at Hosingen, which the Germans needed both as a principal route westward and as egress along the best road leading uphill from the bridge at Gemund, somebody failed to press the attack in keeping with the importance of the objective. After overrunning the platoon of Company K south of the village, the Germans made only a feeble stab at the village itself. It was a lack of aggressiveness that, as the day passed, could hardly be ignored by the division commander, Colonel Kokott. To the north, in the zone of the 2D Panzer Division, the leading battalion of Panzergrenadiers stumbled into an American minefield soon after crossing the Aar River, which so delayed the advance that it was full daylight and the fog had thinned when the men drew up to the village of Marnac astride the Skyline Drive. Since Marnac, with its entry to the road to Clairvaux, was not to be bypassed, the Panzergrenadiers began immediately to attack. Yet Company B and a platoon of towed guns of the 630th Tank Destroyer Battalion were on full alert, and the attack failed. The defenders in the village nonetheless were soon uncomfortably aware that other Germans were bypassing Marnac on either side, heading down a steep slope toward Clairvaux and the positions of their supporting artillery, Battery B, 109th Field Artillery Battalion. In the Hotel Claravallis, Colonel Fuller soon had radio contact with headquarters of his 1st Battalion and his supporting artillery, but so far away was headquarters of the 3D Battalion in Constum that he was unable to get through, nor could he raise the division headquarters in Wiltz. Turning to his executive officer, Colonel Strickler, he told him to go to Wiltz and inform the division commander, General Cotter, that his regiment was under heavy attack, then proceed to Constum and stay there to oversee the defence of the regiment's south wing. By 9 a.m., the telephone line to division headquarters was back in again, and through the division switchboard, Fuller was able to talk with Major Milton in Constum. At about the same time, he received a radio call from Battery C, 109th Field Artillery, under siege in its firing positions behind Hosingen. The Germans had captured one of the battery's 12 howitzers, and even though the artillerymen were still fighting for the others, they needed help desperately. Telephoning Cotter in Wiltz, Fuller demanded release of his 2D Battalion from the division reserve. A big, blustery New Englander known as Dutch, who could be as strong-willed as anybody, Cotter refused. It was too early, the situation not developed fully enough for him to part with his lone infantry reserve. On the other hand, since reports reaching Cotter from his other 2 regiments indicated that the 110th Infantry's situation was the most serious, he afforded Fuller 2 companies of medium tanks of the 707th Tank Battalion, long an attached fighting colleague of the 28th Division. Since the tanks were in a village alongside the Clerve River, only 2 miles from Battery C positions, a platoon was soon on the way. Reaching the nearby village of Bockholtz without difficulty, the 5 tanks enabled the artillerymen to drive off their foe, retake their captured piece, and resume firing. 2 companies of tanks, 34 Shermans, was a considerable force, but in view of the multiple and widely spaced crises confronting the 110th Infantry, it could hardly be employed in the most advantageous fashion as a single unit. Faced with calls for help from almost every direction and under orders to give no ground anywhere, Colonel Fuller parcelled out his newly obtained support piecemeal, a platoon here, half a platoon there. He kept 1 platoon in reserve in Clairvaux and ordered 2 platoons to what he considered to be the most critical spot of all, Marnac, astride the German route to Clairvaux. The 1st Battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Donald Paul, had already tried to help hard-pressed Company B in Marnac by sending a strong patrol south from Company A, which was on the regiment's north flank in the village of Heinescheid, and had yet to come under attack. The patrol got only halfway to Marnac before running into Germans who were bypassing the village. Pinned to the ground for a while by small arms fire, the men of the patrol finally managed to fall back just in time to help their company repel a first attack on Heinescheid. Colonel Paul then ordered his reserve Company C, located with Cannon Company 2 miles southwest of Marnac, on the reverse slope of the Skyline Drive at the village of Munchhausen, to move to Marnac and clear Germans from the southern fringe of the village. The company, under Captain Carroll Copeland, had already begun to march when Colonel Paul learned that Colonel Fuller had 2 platoons of medium tanks earmarked for Marnach. At Paul's request, those 10 tanks headed for Munchausen to overtake and join Company C. The men of Company C had meanwhile come under heavy small arms fire in which Captain Copeland was wounded. They pulled off the road and were trying to advance cross-country. The tankers failed to spot them but nevertheless succeeded in reaching Marnach. Once the southern edge of Marnach was clear of Germans, Colonel Paul had intended sending infantry and tanks together southward to sweep the enemy from the Skyline Drive and move into Hosingen, which he mistakenly believed had fallen. When Company C failed to reach Marnach, Paul ordered one of the tank platoons to retrace its steps, pick up the men of Company C, and help the infantry defend Munchausen. The other platoon of tanks, commanded by First Lieutenant Robert A. Payne, was to drive alone on Hosingen. In the confusion, nobody appeared to notice that those instructions left Company B in the critical village of Marnach without tank support. Indeed, Colonel Fuller, who sanctioned the drive on Hosingen, thought the other platoon had stayed in Marnach. When that platoon turned up in Munchausen, he was convinced that the platoon leader had bugged out. Machine guns blazing, Lieutenant Payne and his tanks swept the 2.5-mile stretch of the Skyline Drive between Marnach and Hosingen, free of Germans at least for a time, and found, with relief, that Company K still held Hosingen. Indeed, Company K and a company of the division's organic 103D Engineer Battalion, which was also in Hosingen, had stood virtually ignored while Germans eddied around them to north and south. A mile south of Hosingen at the crossroads marked by the Café Schinker, in the meantime, men of the platoon of Company L defending the crossroads saw a jeep approaching at mid-morning from the east. Since that was the road taken before daylight by the jeep sent to recall the squad of riflemen scheduled to participate in the training exercise, the men waved to the occupants. In response, they drew a burst of fire from burp guns. Screeching around the corner onto the main road atop the Skyline Drive, the jeep raced up the road toward Hosingen, leaving the men at the crossroads agape, but they had time to note that the jeep bore Company L markings on the bumpers. Down at the Our River, German engineers were working hard to put in bridges, but it was a slow process. Because the bridges had to be stout enough to support big Panther tanks, the girders were heavy, and the terrain around the bridge sites was so confined by the deep river gorge that no heavy equipment could get forward to help. All had to be done by hand. Furthermore, the Our, normally a placid stream, was swollen from rains and melting snow. During the morning, the commander of the 5th Panzer Army, General von Manteuffel, visited both sites. While lamenting the slow progress, he considered that the engineers were doing the best they could under the circumstances. Shortly after 1 p.m., Major Loose engineers finally completed the bridge for the 2D Panzer Division at Dasburg, whence ran the road to Marnach and Clairvaux. The Mark IV and Panther tanks were nevertheless slow to cross, for a narrow, precipitous approach road on the east bank had a succession of hairpin turns that was hard for the ponderous tanks to negotiate. Only 10 had crossed the span when the next tank in column took the last turn too short, crashed into one side of the bridge, and plunged into the water. Except for the driver, the crew escaped, but repairing the bridge consumed another 2 hours, so that it was late afternoon before tanks could begin crossing again. At about the same time, around 4 p.m., engineers of the Panzer Lehr Division completed a bridge downstream at Gemund. Throughout the afternoon, German pressure was intense almost everywhere except at Hosingen, and almost everywhere the American troops were running low on ammunition. As darkness approached, each little garrison was virtually surrounded, yet nowhere had they given in, although Company L in Holstham held at that point only a few houses and a barn. On the other hand, the complexion of the battle was about to change, for with 2 bridges across the Our River, the Germans would soon have the added strength of tanks and other armoured vehicles. Additional firepower was first apparent on the forward slope of the Skyline Drive near Walhausen, where the lone platoon of Company 1 was holding at the former battalion observation post. Soon after it was fully dark, flak wagons with quadruple-mounted 20mm guns joined the attack. Almost out of ammunition, the platoon leader, First Lieutenant Jack Fisher, radioed for artillery fire on top of his position. He got it, but that failed to stop the Germans. Only one of Fisher's men got away. Fisher himself, although captured, soon eluded his guards in the darkness and eventually made his way back to the battalion headquarters in Constam. The rest of Company 1 in the nearby village of Weiler was in little better shape than the detached platoon. Surrounded and virtually out of ammunition, the company commander, Captain Floyd K. McCutcheon, determined to break out after nightfall. He himself took charge of one group of 50 men, while First Lieutenant Edward Jenkins led a second group of similar size. Although the two groups were supposed to rendezvous at a designated point along the Skyline Drive, Jenkins and his men got diverted by an encounter with a German patrol, never reached the rendezvous point, and ended up the next day at a village still in American hands along the Clerve River. McCutcheon and his group, meanwhile, waited in vain all night for Jenkins's arrival. The next day they fought their way past one German force after another, until at last they reached the road behind Constam, where an ambulance driver told McCutcheon that troops of the 3D Battalion still held the village. Turning over the wounded to the driver, Captain McCutcheon and the 35 men still left to him plodded wearily up the road toward Constam and back into the fight. Meanwhile in Clairvaux, Colonel Fuller early on the afternoon of the 16th rounded up 60 men of the 110th Infantry who had been on leave in the town and sent them to Roiler, a village just north of the Marnac Road, there to protect the firing positions of Battery B, 109th Field Artillery. They arrived just in time to help half-tracks of the division's attached anti-aircraft artillery keep the Germans from overrunning the battery. Yet it was obvious to all that the howitzers would soon have to displace or fall into German hands. Near nightfall they managed to get out and took up new firing positions alongside the Clerve River in the shadow of the chateau in Clairvaux. In late afternoon, Fuller again appealed to General Cotter for release of his 2D Battalion from the Division Reserve, but again Cotter refused. What about some 200 men from other units of the division who, like the 60 of the 110th Infantry, had been on leave in Clairvaux? Those, said Cotter, Fuller could use. Organised into a provisional company, those men and the few officers among them, armed only with rifles and carbines, began to dig in to block hairpin curves in the road from Marnac as it descended into Clairvaux. The crews of two heavy .30 caliber machine guns soon joined them, and after nightfall a platoon of 57 anti-tank guns. The little force was obviously makeshift and thin, but except for the platoon of Shermans in reserve, it was all Fuller had for defence of his headquarters town. For a last-ditch defence within the town itself, he ordered cooks, clerks, MPs, anybody who could be spared from his duties in the headquarters, to organise the old chateau as a strong point. Defence it would be, for there could be no question of withdrawal. Early in the day, General Cotter had passed on the order from the Corps Commander, General Middleton, directing all units to hold until their positions became completely untenable. Even then, they were not to withdraw beyond a specified line, which in the 110th Infantry sector included Marnac and thus Clairvaux. Cotter himself, later in the day, reinforced Middleton's order by admonishing everybody to hold at all costs. Orders or no, the sorely pressed men of Company B in Marnac were close to going under. Their commander had been wounded early in the fighting and evacuated, so that the 1st Battalion's executive officer, Captain James H. Burns, had assumed command. An hour after nightfall, Burns reported by radio that the Germans were attacking again, supported by half-tracks firing machine guns. That was the last word to come from the men who had so stoutly defended Marnac, but a continuing noise of firing from the village gave Colonel Fuller hope that some of them were still holding out. If only he could get his hands on his 2D Battalion, he might restore the position at Marnac and save Clairvaux. Around 9 p.m, General Cotter telephoned Fuller. He was considering releasing the 2D Battalion, said Cotter. If he did, what would Fuller do with it? He would attack, Fuller replied without hesitation, to relieve Marnac, and if that proved successful, he would continue south to Hosingen, where early that evening the Germans had at last launched a heavy attack against Company KOK, said Cotter. He could have the battalion minus one rifle company, which Cotter retained to protect the division headquarters. As Fuller drew up his plans for an attack before daylight the next morning, he learned that Cotter had ordered the 707th Tank Battalion's Light Tank Company, which had spent the first day uncommitted by the 112th Infantry, to attack at daylight down the Skyline Drive to Marnac. That prompted Fuller to delay the 2D Battalion's attack an hour to coincide with the drive by the light tanks. At the same time, the medium tank platoon at Munchausen, along with a platoon of Company C riflemen, was also to drive on Marnac. As December 16th neared an end, the commander of the 47th Panzer Corps, General von Luttwitz, had to accept that he had fallen well short of his first day's objective, crossings over the Clerve River. That was attributable in part to the delay in getting bridges installed across the Our, but even when the bridges were in, the Panzer Lehr Division was in for more delay when vehicles mired on the unpaved roads leading from Giemund and blocked them. The failure was also attributable in part to the unsuccessful application of the Hutier tactics by units of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, for except at Hosingen and at the Café Schinker crossroads, the Volksgrenadiers had been unable to avoid a fight. They were like a man who tries to sneak past a hornet's nest, only to find the hornets swarming at him so ferociously that he has to stop and try to destroy the nest. Nor had the Hutier tactics worked much better for the two Panzergrenadier regiments of the 2D Panzer Division. The Germans had taken only 3 defended positions, Marnach, Weiler, and the position held by a single platoon of Company 1 near Wollhausen. With the arrival of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division's reserve regiment, they finally mounted an attack at Hosingen, but there Company K and its engineer support were still strong. Only at Holzthum was another American force near caving in, so near in fact that the commander of Company L, Lieutenant Seaman, ordered his platoon at the Café Schinker crossroads to fall back to Holzthum to help, but the platoon was unable to break into the village and had to go instead to join the defenders at Consthum. The fact that the Germans had failed to achieve their objective was also attributable to the intrepidity of the American soldier. With only 2 battalions supported for part of the day by 2 companies of medium tanks, the 110th Infantry had held off 4 German regiments and had nowhere been routed. That was around 2,000 men versus at least 10,000, and the men of the 110th Infantry had done it at times without normal artillery support, so hard-pressed were 2 of the 4 supporting batteries. Considering the odds, nowhere on the first day of the German offensive was there a more remarkable achievement by the American soldier. Yet how much more punishment could those men take? Hundreds dead, hundreds wounded, possibly more than 100 captured, and the survivors all short of ammunition. There were hopes for the morrow, of course, when 2/3 of the reserve infantry battalion, about 600 men, was to join the fight. What the American commanders could not know was that just before midnight, Mark IV tanks of the 2D Panzer Division, all resistance finally eliminated at Marnach, were beginning to assemble in the village, to be ready with the start of a new day to head downhill toward the little town of Clairvaux and its 2 bridges over the Clerve River.